It's hard. It's hard. Okay, there you go. Yes, yes. Right, hi guys. Welcome to round 4. Can you hear who's speaking first? Right. Okay. Who's speaking first? Can you hear? Yeah. Nigel speaking first. CG, what's it mean? And who's speaking first? So I don't know. There. CEO, substituting hasn't that on what? Hasn't that. Okay. Who's going next? Okay. In the interest of full disclosure, just like to tell everyone that the Deputy Prime Minister used to be my teammate in my brief stint in high school debating. Is anybody uncomfortable with that? No? Okay, cool. Alright. I was there until after this. Alright, so on the motion that everybody knows, I call us order. I invite the Prime Minister to speak on the motion stands and his team.
All speaker deserves a life, right? A child that have not been provided to him just because he was born in such conditions, just because he was left in this world like this, doesn't necessarily mean we abandon him and to face the harsh of the world, right? Yes, there are possible solutions in the status quo right now, but how actively do we, how actively do these citizens really opt into that by adopting him and taking care of him, right? And how does it really work out? Because nowadays modern technology has made it possible for people to and their own different means or method if there was a couple that did not get a child by normal means, right? So in general, we believe that is a conflict when it comes down to the lives of these children that we must ensure as a state, right? So first of all, some clarifications to be made, right? First of all, let's characterize who these foster children are, right? First of all, these children are being taken care of by foster families, or they're kept in a foster home, right, where they're being given the basic necessities that the government can provide, or maybe it's done by religion groups as well. So in general, these children are usually kept in masses in these foster homes, so they get we can provide them what they need to some certain extent, because we believe this is not completely to the extent what a child should deserve and what is the yardstick of a child, what he should really deserve, right? He deserves a better life and that. And after home, as we said, that they're mostly government responsibility. This is one of the major issues, because nowadays people start to think these children are no longer children, they are burdens of the state, right? This is a really bad characterization when it comes down to these children that the people actually make, right? So we believe we have to remove this tag or burden off their head and make sure that they are treated as any other children is. And secondly, we must also consider the fact about why people opt into other options, because there are reasons like social reputation and trade-off in this debate when it comes down to these kind of factors, right? So let's move on to my first argument, which is the lottery of birth, right? First, how children's rights are, right? They deserve a family, because we believe what a child is actually a representation of what this family actually takes care of him, and he represents that family when he actually grows up, right? Something a child deserves. So in necessity, we believe there are so many child rights. We believe a child, even though if he doesn't have a father or mother, deserves a family, because their families are there to cater. He can. The families feel special, which we as a state cannot do in foster homes, because catered with other children, and they don't have mom and dad have a sister anyone from a particular person acting as a guardian, right? We really they don't get to enjoy these privileges. But what happens is this actually further this is actually not something they deserve, right? Because just because it's lottery of birth, we as a government put a blanket policy on this issue, right? That we have a foster home, they'll be taken care of. But find the problem, I'll move on to the idea of foster home. We must compare how a child is when he's in a family and how a child acts when he's in a foster home, right? Throughout his whole life, you always clear the idea of the child that you don't have a father or mother. Either you've been abandoned, either you were born without them being in the presence to take care of you. We really further stigmatize them already at the start, and we really they start to seek for someone who they can actually call mom or dad, right? So in the end, we believe putting a blanket policy that foster homes are there to cater for and we as the government would provide welfare isn't enough, right? Because we believe we're still depriving them of the rights that they can actually enjoy, have a family, have a proper foundation to grow and be representative of that family and grow like any other child, not feel so sad and lonely just because other childs have this entity called mom and another entity called dad, right? We believe these childs are equally deserving of this, and just because we assume there's lottery of birth, we don't necessarily gain the right to make this decision, right? So we believe this blanket policy has to go. And I'll further talk about the rhetorics that are already set in status quo when it comes down to producing children by the help of sperm donations and things like that. But before that, I'll take question.
Your policy is very for children. It's not actually forcing them to adopt the child or to adopt other children. If you really believe it's so crucial, why don't you go the next step?
No, see, I'll talk about this in the rhetorics, right? Why they actually opting too much and why this rhetoric is something we have to fight, right? Because I already stated the problem of how people see these children as a burden and nothing they want to own, right? So let's talk about how the rhetoric is in the current status quo, right? They already clearly mentioned that these couples want to feel a feeling of owningness to this. But we believe this is not how the foundation of parents work, because first of all, the couples who are willing to adopt also take those kind of steps are people who are actually willing to have a family and wants a child to a desperate measure, right? That they're actually acting on those things and treading those things, right? So we believe this rhetoric of there being the societal aspect that push people to think that you must have a child and that must be of your own, right? So we believe that is a wrong push that these societies are improving, because when you talk about sperm banks and the other IPIS, how do they really work? Actually, people actually want to do it under concealment, right? Nobody wants to give out the info of how this sperm bank works, right? Because when you adopt someone, you clearly have to give out the info, and your societal reputation is at stake. But we believe it's only empowered by the rhetoric, which we want to fight, because people think these children are actually burden, right? So when we actually impose in favor of adaptation, we promote these ideas, and it's a trade-off that we should actually make, right? Because we believe the emphasis on people should not be on owningness, is to have a proper family, right? And also to think those children are actually someone we should take care of, not just burdens of state, right? Something we clearly have in status quo. So in order to fight this rhetoric, we must promote the adaptation, because this clearly clears out the mindset of the people and have in favor of how they should adopt, right? Because this is how the ideology of adaptation works, and something we must cater to as government, because we believe we are giving them welfare already, but we're not giving them what actual child deserves. With this, I would like to end my speech and hope and propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Now, some case of opposition, I invite the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, apart from the fact that all side government really did throughout the 7-minute speech was talk about why adoption was good, we had no mention nor no inquiry as to why the banning in its entity of any form of reproductive methods should take place. That's what the debate is centered upon. There is no form of compulsion in the sense of wanting to adopt a child. It is still merely mentioned as an option. That is what they are not proclaiming in their side of the house. They are misleading this motion. Number one, before I move on to my substantives, I have two rebuttals. The entire idea that was portrayed from the side of opening government was this, that foster homes, anyone who houses children without a family, are overcrowded, they don't offer the best space, they don't offer the best facilities, and we, as people who have the capacity to take them in, are obliged to do so. We are obliged to intervene. Here's the underlying problem with this. Now, we don't deny that children in foster care may not, in fact, receive the best care possible. But we also can't objectively say that the obligation lies with us who, in essence, weren't cumulatively responsible for the birth of said child, right? We allow for people to do so when they feel like it's a moral obligation, but we don't morally compel them to do so for the sole reason that we understand it was not the doings of these outside individuals for the birthings or of any and all children, right? This is why their entire idea for which they say we are obligated to intervene should be a compulsion for us. It's misleading and it's not backed up by proper substantive. Second, they told you this, that children have the right to belong to a family and be a representative of that family. We think this is very good. Indeed, any child who was born out of the result of either wanting or even negligence should belong to a family. But again, it leads back to the very same idea that any child who was birthed out of no consequence of yourself should not be held accountable to be fully responsible for a child. In other words, the entire idea of being obliged to care or to take in a child, despite the fact you had no doings or intervening for the birth of a child, does not make sense at all. The obligation lies on whoever feels the need to do so and whoever has the capacity to do so, should they decide to do it. Before I move on to my substantives, yes, please.
So, if we have no moral obligations in children obligations, why do our tax dollars go to pay for state services that fund these same obligations?
Yeah, sure. Because we offer protection to any and all who are helpless. This is why we take care of the paralyzed. This is why we take care of the mentally or physically handicapped. This is what we do as a state. That is in some form a moral compulsion, but it's not in the sense when you're talking about the common individual. You can lay the responsibility on the state because these are some of the things that the state assumes. You can't put it on the layman citizen or anyone else. That's not a fair obligation to put. But on to my first substantive. Why is the idea of banning any form of artificial reproductive methods and offering adoption as a viable alternative? Well, first, we tell you this, that any kind of bond or range of human emotions between a parent and, say, a genetical offspring, as opposed to the adoption, is always going to supersede what happens when you take in someone else's child, right? Now, although we can see that this is in fact an option, what we first have to look at is people who are unable to produce offspring of their own. These are the people who turn to things like sperm banks and who turn to things like in vitro fertilization to attain offspring, right? If you deny them any and all rights to do so, you leave them, quite frankly, with no other option other than to adopt. This is the underlying problem that we need to accept. What we observe in, say, human species was that although we have the capacity to take in someone else's offspring, even offspring of a different species, it does not translate into the same care or affection that we give to our own. This is the underlying problem which we need to address, and it's why we say that the idea of compelling someone to adopt and cancel interest, they are talking about the groups as a whole, but they are not looking into the psyche of a child raised by someone who is not their genetical parents. And second, we tell you this, that adoption as a viable option means that some degree of care and affection may not be awarded to the child as if, right? Mother scenarios are not held parent for the sole reason of either wanting to love someone or either wanting to someone. To which we say this: if this is the compelling idea, a mother or parents are going to look for any way for which they can attain an offspring. The argument that comes from our side is quite simply this, that if they were to look to adoption as their only viable option, they may fulfill the instinctive need to have a child and to care for an offspring. It does not fulfill the long-term needs of what a mother feels towards his or her own genetic offspring. For the sole reason, when a mother bears a child for 9 months during the stage of pregnancy, it prepares her body. This is the psychological aspect that cannot be linked with no viable alternatives to move on towards. Before I move on, yes.
It is more likely concerned with people who cannot have their own child. Like the same thing, you're getting a child from our source.
Yeah, sure. Okay. The fact of the matter is, if you deny them any and all rights to do this by means of not obtaining someone else's child, then the only thing which we can turn towards is artificial insemination. The only thing that we can turn towards are sperm banks. This is what you have to acknowledge when we say you don't leave them with any viable alternative or any viable option. This is something that people are going to have to turn to, not out of the obligation of wanting to start a familial union as what they proclaim throughout the entity of their argument, but rather for the simple need to fulfill the maternal instinct or the parental instinct to which we argue quite for wet age of pregnancy and knew any doubtful cause that this was the child they wanted to have, not purely birth out of their own right.
Thank you very much. Leader of opposition. Completely opening up this case, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
What opening government has already told you, we concede to the fact that we are making a trade-off between the rights of these parents to have their children artificially inseminated, and we're willing to make that trade-off simply because we think that these children, by the way, adoption is viable, right? We don't never necessarily think we're not able to take care of a child who is adopted. We think this is a very bad characterization of what happens in today's world, and we'll argue to you why this trade-off, whether these parents deserve the rights or children deserve rights, and we'll tell you that children has the higher authority in this matter. But firstly, on to rebutting whatever came up these options, right? But what for you is in adoption, that becomes the only option, just in case you were still confused, right? This means that the only option that children have under our paradigm is about adoption. Okay. Secondly, here's what they told us in response to Raihan's argument, right? And that how foster homes don't facilitate the right environment. They tell you that they have no obligation. Ladies and gentlemen, when we compel you to adopt, you naturally have the incentive, right? See, the problem that they have now, the authority, children in foster homes are not our burden. We find that extremely problematic because we think that when you have these children, that the state's responsibility is the state's responsibility to give them a home, but we also think it's part of your responsibility to take care of these children. We think that if you really want a kid, you'll be willing to adopt a kid and take care of them. Because who are these people who want to adopt? Who are these people who go to a sperm bank, who go for IVFs, right? These are people who want a family. So we necessarily think the sort of love and care that will never happen is something that is untrue. Because if you argue that means under your paradigm, you have families who adopt people who never necessarily care about their children. We think this is a very harmful characterization, right? Because what we think this sort of care and attention that you give to kids is a very natural instinct. Because if you want a family, you have those natural instincts of parenting. You naturally want to take care of people. We think that this is fine, right? Secondly, they talk to you about, right, a sort of like informed choice, right? When you go to adoption, you make an informed choice. You know what you're getting into. We don't necessarily think that you will never care about these children. No, sit down. Thirdly, they want to talk about pregnant people. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about people who can't naturally reproduce. Obviously, the government can't defend people who will only have their own child. What we tell you is necessary, even then, even if you want to argue that they should have their own legacy, we tell you that's a problem, right? This owingness, this feeling that we need to own our children, that we need to have children with our genetics, right? We tell you this is extremely problematic because you always abandon this sort of group of children, right? We naturally have more orphanages, more foster homes, and this is why we'll argue to you why these kids should be prioritized, right? So move on smoothly to my trade-off between the parents' rights and the children's rights, right? We've already told you, like the birth lottery, right? We told you that these children never necessarily choose their circumstances, right? And we tell you that they deserve a family. Why? Because it's essential to their development as a member of society, a member who is going to join society in the future, right? Because what this means is that foster homes and orphanages can never actually have the sort of love and care that parents can provide. This is the difference that we make when we leave them in foster homes and orphanages, and the difference of having a family who actually cares for you, who actually teaches you all those moral rights and moral and ethics that we have, right? But before I go on, yes.
What if a child grew up and then decided that he never really wanted to be adopted, but he wanted to be joined by his companions who also suffer a similar
It's a very extreme case, number one. But secondly, we argue to it's a very small scenario. Like, secondly, we argue to that it's more important. We'll make that choice. We'll prioritize these kids who need a family, and I don't know, like that's weird. Secondly, we'll tell you that. Okay, it's not the same. We're not saying that if you grew up in an orphanage in your foster home, you will turn out bad. You will never be a productive member of society. But the important thing is the sort of mentality that you grew up with when you're in an orphanage, when you're a foster home. You see the differences that you have with other kids who had a family, right? You see, like, okay, this person had a family, and the sort of children's mentality is that they always compare themselves to that, and they'll never feel that they had the sort of environment that every kid deserves to have. Secondly, we tell you, right now, sit down. We've already extended this to making parents have only one option, right? Because we think that's extremely essential. We've told you already the stigmatization that happens, right? Where kids never necessarily, the kids will be stigmatized, right, by fellow peers of their society, fellow peers who naturally think that they never had the right childhood to grow up with, right? Secondly, thirdly, we tell you, right, that it's extremely essential because it's sort of trade-offs. Fine, we necessarily don't see the importance of you having your own genetically linked kid, right? Because we don't see this as a necessary right to have. We think that as a member of society, you're entitled to certain rights, right? It's a state responsibility to take care of you. What happens then is you leave these kids to a certain limitation, right? Where state can only take care of them in sort that they have like shelter, basic necessities. But we think what is extremely essential is to have that love and care that only can come when you have a family, right? So what have we told you today? We've told you 4 things, right? We've told you why it's extremely important that these foster children need a family, they're a dog. We think it's extremely problematic that they're characterized as a burden by the state, right? They're characterized as a burden by society. We told you that this owingness is something that we don't really need in society. We tell you that these children, right, they deserve a family. This lottery of birth, where they're in orphanages, is a blanket policy. We think it's extremely unfair. And we also tell you that these families, right, banks, they already have to take care of their children. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. Now, to conclude the opening half, I'd like to invite you to Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be talking to you on 3 things. Firstly, is on this idea of how we get to mitigate irresponsible behavior in society, hence solving the root problem of like people or kids even going to adoption. Also talk to you on this idea of how we need to maximize parents' choices, so that when you maximize parents' choices, they're able to decide what is best for them, and they'll be able to take care of the child in their best capacity, and that's their only role, and that's the role they should play in society. Also talk to you on another substantive regarding research and development, and just explain spin off metrics in which we will get why not ban and why not completely banning this policy. Before that, the sponsors, right? I questioned her in my POI, asking her like, okay, what about kids who generally wanted to not grow up, not be adopted, and then not adopted, and then they want to be they wanted to also join their counterparts who are also grew up in a similar situation, or they probably put into an adoption home from the young. Like, you still deny these individuals of their right to self-actualize, because you have to recognize that there are also kids like this within foster homes, and you also need to cater within these things. You can't come up here and tell me that these are just the minority of individuals who don't necessarily play this part. You also need to consider the situation, because that's a trade-off, right? It's either the kid you don't, because there's no proper yardstick in determining what exactly the kid defines as happiness. So in this case, right, the kid can also obtain happiness by being with his friends and growing up with his friends, rather than going to family and doing whatever love which you want to. It may be scientifically proven, but you don't have a black and white and a yardstick and a line which determines that you can actually you don't actually know what exactly happiness means to a child. No, thank you. Now, secondly, it's on this idea of how parents aren't. I mean, like, if you go to things such as IVF and sperm banks, it isn't really a child. So we don't actually think so, because if you go to things such as IVF and sperm banks, you technically have half of a genetics within that baby. So you feel a sense of involvement within that baby, and you think that sense of involvement is extremely good. Mr. Speaker, what is the debate, right? What is the debate coming from opening option? This debate is about maximizing a parent's choice in order to choose what is best for his or her child. And we think that your side restricts parents' ability for them to choose. No, thank you. For them to choose, and the harms in which occurs from this is that, firstly, you can't necessarily ensure that parents will take care of the child up to its full maximum extent, because the reason why the state gives you rights to actually take care of the child is because they expect you to maximize your ability to take care of the child, to make sure that he's happy. If you're going to block out one option and one possible part in which the parents can actually do it, that means the parents won't be able to maximize their capacity to actually be the best parent in this case. Because you have to also understand there's going to be like geographical limitations, and there's also going to be like features or limitations, right? Because parents sometimes they go to adoption homes, right? They want to look for kids who are generally to look like that, to talk like that, and things like this, right? So even under your case policy, right, you can't exactly find the perfect child, right? But our policy can guarantee it, because parents now have the capacity to make children who are similar to them, and they are able to interact with them better. I think it's important for governments to recognize that this is extremely that this helps within the self-actualization of the child, because parents will be able to take out the children better. No, thank you. Now, so like I say, what does this then lead to, right? Because if you block out this whole option of parents into artificial reproduction methods, this means that they don't have a yardstick to compare to, right? What are the benefits and what are the harms of doing something? Because if you only have adoptions, right, parents aren't able to fully rationalize what is the best option for them to become a parent. But only when you have alternatives, right, such as IVF and such as sperm banks, that's when you're only able to actually rationalize what are the harms and benefits of actually making that decision, and you'll be able to fully maximize your ability as a parent to take care of your children. Because the problem I have with that is that you've brought up the possibility and the potential for parents to provide maximum amount of happiness towards the kids, because kids who may be born will not be able to obtain that right anyways, and then that's there which you think will happen. No, thank you. Now, also, we think that it's also important to recognize, like, the reasons of like why the children actually go to adoption. Some of them may be due to birth living. Unfortunately, the parents died very young. Also, kids who are also born due to vices, like, such as unwanted sex, so on and so forth. I think it's extremely important to recognize that these individuals, parents who voluntarily put their children into adoption, right? We need to recognize they're helpless. I think that they were able to solve at least some parts of this problem. Because we think that the reason why they do this is because they know that there's always an option for other more responsible parents to actually take care of kids. If you do this, right, that means you also block out the ability for them to actually rationally determine, hey, look, like okay, maybe if I give away my child now, I may not have a proper guardian, so I don't necessarily need to have that guardian. So in incentive, you incentivize those to be more responsible towards the kids, and this may provide more caring attitudes towards his parents. Before that, opening.
See, when you adopt a child, you don't just give your child in a big box, right? They obviously have to go through procedures like interview, background check, to ensure these children are facilitated with their maximum things the parents can provide. Why is that a problem?
Yeah, exactly. Like these are all those neutral things. You don't know what happiness means. Therefore, you can't put a black and white policy that this is the only way for you to go, and this is the only way a kid can actually opt happiness. We want to maximize the parents' ability to have a choice. I mean, what exactly is the? We want to maximize the parents' ability to make a choice, so that they are able to fully maximize the potential as a parent, not to show happiness towards the kids and allow the kids to self-actualize within that society. That's why we need to give parents the choice. We're not telling that parents will not go and adopt because there's still an option for them to go down, but you then now give them the platform to rationalize inside what is best for them, right? Because you also need to analyze their capabilities and what is best for them to become parents. And finally, society is on research and development. With that, if you completely block out this whole artificial reproductive methods, you stop you basically stop the progress of the development. Why is this harmful? Because firstly, now you make procedures, pregnancy-related procedures much less safer because you're not able to delve into that certain area. Also, secondly, you also may lose out on spin-off benefits such as safer methods for like pregnancy tests, so on and so forth. Because these are the kind of spin-off benefits we can get if we don't completely block out these options, right? We think that's extremely important towards the whole medical pregnancy system and how you can enhance it. Opening option stands for the right of parents to choose to maximize the ability to take care of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, FD. Moving on to the closing remarks, I'd like to invite the member of the hearing.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to say this, but the debate starts here. Because beyond the discussion of orphanages that happened in the opening house, we think the deeper problem underlying all of them is something that underpinned the opening opposition's case. The idea that parents have an intrinsic natural bond to their biological children. But we ask you, where's the moral value in that? Naturalistic fallacy, right? Because it's natural that parents do, so it's morally good, that's the best possible world we can live in. What we're going to do in closing government rather, is we're going to reframe a more moral parenting, calling out the why fetishizing biological ownership of your children is bad, therefore why we're willing to restrict options that allow people to access that. And then we're going to talk about why these artificial methods also visit all sorts of gender and classist oppressions upon various parents. But before that, and obviously I'm going to deal with the bulk of this material about nature in my substantive, but before that, let's talk about some ancillary rebuttal of orphanages. So what we heard from opening up, one, we heard some kids don't want to be adopted. One, to some extent we can take their preferences into account, but we also don't think this is very likely, given that they're probably going to go to better funded places in a world where orphanages are underfunded and understaffed. But also more importantly, we make choices for children all the time. And that's why a child who is a biological parent can't run away from his parents unless there is evidence of significant abuse at the age of 5. Because we make choices for these children and we know they don't make good choices. But okay, next. Data told us, where you have choices on which set of methods to use, or be it artificial methods or adoptive methods, then obviously you the ability to choose between these methods suggests that you care more on the one you prefer the one that you chose. Well, obviously, so that's precisely your point. To the extent to which you can access both methods, and a world where parents are more likely to choose artificial methods, that means that parents generally and normatively neglect kids who are adopted. So that's something that we can stand for. No, thank you. They then told us it's really important that we have this set of artificial methods because they allow us to compare the benefits with adoption. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of strange to say this because presumably artificial methods didn't stay around forever. Like, they exist because now we have the science to make them exist. Once upon a time, parents made a decision whether to adopt or not, precisely based purely on the benefits of adoption or not. So we're not sure why restricting this particular set of choices was morally important. All they're saying is more choices is good because we get to choose more things. If you can demonstrate that it's one set of choices is problematic, none of these concerns really matter. The last point they told us was about moral hazard and about how we need more degree of research into these things. Again, if we didn't think that artificial methods were good lines of research to play through, we didn't think we needed to make them more safe. And we thought they were quite unsafe in the status quo. We thought the moral hazard point about how this will make people more irresponsible was strange, because firstly it's an argument against adoption in general, against the very existence of orphanages and adoption agencies. But also we didn't really care about this because we thought in our world, when we reframed our mindsets towards parenting, we were more likely to care for children altogether regardless of a biological connection to them. So let's get to this idea of the fetishization of biological ownership. That goes to the heart of the opening up of such case. So it's strange they don't actually talk about it. So what we heard from opening up is that there is an intrinsic link to the child which comes out of your body, which is your own flesh and blood. That's precisely the point, that people think of a birth child as theirs. There is this maternal instinct which innately connects biological children to their parents. We think about things in words like they're our flesh and blood. So there's a degree of possession in the way we talk about our children, and we treat, on the contrary, is not our own flesh and blood. But Mr. Speaker, it's entirely arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary because these children are born to a birth or a biological lottery. Like the fact that you happen to be born to this particular set of parents shouldn't matter to how that parents decide to treat you. This is a morally empty claim, Mr. Speaker. Just because it's how the world naturally operates, how our bodies are made, doesn't mean that it's one that leads to better outcomes. Because it's a world where we all normatively not receive the same level of care and concern as biologically born children. So that's a harm. The norm exists. Continuing to do things that allows for this norm is bad. But more important, when they tell us things like you have to be the person's mother in order to really love the child, that's what causes adoptees to suffer. The alternative, Mr. Speaker, is simple. We need to recast parenthood as a measure of human responsibility, as something that's non-selfish, that's not born out of your biological connection to your child, and that's not born out of your possessive duty to decide what this object this person, this child that belongs to you becomes. That's the basis of biological parenting, and it's one that we want to break. Before I go.
Let's say you also will talk about responsible parents who have created children for artificial reproduction. What about them? What about the kids who they could have grown up to be successful?
So look, we don't think they're irresponsible parents. We think, yes, of course, you go ahead, and if in a world where artificial methods are allowed, and you go on and have a child and raise a child perfectly, that's great for that individual child, for that individual family. We think it's terrible in general because it creates this norm that biological parenting and the biological link between the parent and the child is the most important one. Alternatively, we can think of childhood as parenting as a human responsibility. So when you adopt a child, you're not caring for this child because he or she is yours, because he or she is a person in need of care, where you are the only person in a unique position to provide care for this child. So you have the responsibility and the duty to care for this uniquely vulnerable individual, and that is a more moral sense of parenting. That sense of parenting is a world where we should focus on adoption rather, where children already exist in this world, rather than fetishizing biological methods. But what does the fetishization of biological and artificial methods provide? It creates often a gendered trauma process. So we think the IVF process can be quite traumatic, and often all of these tests that a woman has to go through in this process, the invasive surgery that she goes through, even the innate trauma of childbirth itself, Madam Speaker, we think these things are biologically unpleasant for women to go through. And we think in a world where these things weren't fetishized as good, we prefer to live in that world. So we think that the pressures of fetishization of biology are what causes overwhelmingly men to say we'd rather have an IVF child and subject you as the mother to this battery of invasive and stressful tests, rather than adopting a child. So we think the incidence of that is overwhelmingly born by women, which is not something that we're happy to support. But also, Mr. Speaker, we thought that poor people were shut out of these treatments because they were really expensive, that people who are either lesbian couples or gay couples who could never hope to actually have a biological child who represented the union of their DNA were also shut out of the norm of the idea that children had to be biological. That was not something we're happy to stand for, we're happy to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government. Now, we please have the Member of Opposition. Yes.
I think what has debate is an understanding of who these children are, how they're possibly not children sometimes. They can be teenagers, they can come from very difficult backgrounds, which is the reason why most parents feel they are incapable of caring psychologically for them. Under these circumstances, we think in no such way should parents ever feel coerced by the state for any reason or other to take completely incapable of doing so, right? The three things I'm going to be talking about within my speech, rebuttals and extensions amalgamated. Let's talk about who goes for IVF and why they so actively refuse to adopt even though that option is already available in status quo. Secondly, let's talk about the challenges of adoption and basically then also let's talk about changing the idea of what genetics and having a natural family is, which directly clashes with all of Yarn's extension. So who goes for IVF and why are they so against adoption within status quo, right? Because they understand it already is an option, so they kind of already make the active choice to not go so, but decided to pour thousands and thousands of dollars in, okay, yeah, maybe it's an invasive process to their own body, right? But this was a choice they made. Maybe because they had an idea, or they did have an idea of what a natural family was. Maybe it was because of religious reasons, right? Every husband wants all the little husbands running around for some bloody reason, doesn't want to adopt, because maybe they come from a culture that emphasize basically the kind of blood being thicker than water, and the kinds of obligations you have towards your family, both past and within the future. We don't think these are morally wrong systems to have within society. So long as they emphasize care, so long as they emphasize basically general goodwill for all those who were related to you, right? We don't think that so long as the state allows for these kinds of cultures to flourish, basically any Indian or Asian or Jewish societies, you can't immediately tell these people, hey, no, we're punishing you for it. But they also need to be able to understand that their model doesn't really compel people to suddenly turn to adoption, right? Because if they already chose within status quo to not want to do it, we think that all of these difficulties or all of these conceptions of what their ideal family would be like doesn't change, and more likely than not, they're not going to want to adopt. What then happens? We think that yes, these people are then punished for the birth lottery, if you want to emphasize the birth lottery, because I was born infertile, because I was born with an inability to conceive, or I tend to shoot blanks whenever I don't know, have sex with my wife, whatever. Just because I can't give birth, I am now being punished by the state for it, because everybody else around me, natural families continue to occur everywhere else. No, thank you. We think the minority, and now wants to talk about how we want to change the ways in which we want to view genetics and nationalists within society, in which case will stop everybody else from giving birth as well and have them adopt kids before they're allowed to maybe give birth as well. No thanks, yeah, but no, you never ever emphasized that you were going to force everybody to not be able to give birth and have their own natural children. Rather, you are targeting a very tiny minority in society. We don't think any norms are going to be changed in the process. Rather, you think you hurt them and you punish them for just being born infertile. No. Secondly, let's talk about the challenges of adoptions, right? And let's just understand that babies children and little toddlers tend to be adopted very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Why? Because most people recognize that these are children who are as yet unformed, who do not maybe really have personalities yet, and therefore also have not been through, undergone like the trauma of perhaps being raped by your dad or your granddad, who have not maybe seen their mom blowing their dad's brains out in front of them, or have been like beaten for multiple years before they were finally discovered. These are people who we regret are psychologically damaged. This does not mean that everybody else needs or is capable of taking care of them. And the state should in no such way push the burden to childless couples who have to take care of them, who are absolutely incapable of doing so, right? We think it's a highly challenging process, and this is why we never really wanted to adopt women status quo to begin with. But let's take that case at its best, right? Because Young wanted to change perceptions on what we feel we have moral obligations towards people in uniquely vulnerable position. Great, this already happens in status quo. People wanting to emulate Angelina Jolie and adopt poor little kids from Uganda and Africa and things like that, right? Lots of privileged white people feel like they want to do it. What happens? They do it. They try their best for 6 months. They are unable to deal with the psychological trauma these kids have undergone. They are unable to reach out to them culturally because, you know, they have to learn a different language and all of those things. And no matter how much the state tries to screen them through, it's until the parents spend an extended amount of time with the big children, they will never know how ready they are. And by the time they realize they're not ready, the kid may have been with them for maybe a few months or so, maybe a couple of years before social services decides that maybe the parents are unable to take care of the kids after all. What happens to those kids? What? They're shipped back to Africa, they're shipped back to whichever country they come from, to whatever shitty childcare state, and with even more trauma because now they've been flown cross country and then told that they are unwanted and incapable of being taken care of. We don't think these kinds of kids deserve that kind of treatment. Yes.
Natalie, you suggested that for example, in your world or this world being punished for not being able to have children. Do you think homosexuals are punished for the same way?
No, right? This is why IVF is a great thing for homosexuals. This is where I'm going to move on to the next part of my speech. Let's change the idea of what a natural family means, right? Because Jan's extension was that, IVF is traumatizing to women. IVF discriminates against homosexuals, both of which are horrendously untrue, right? Okay, fine, maybe it's traumatizing. So is childbirth, Jan. So are plenty of things that women go through. If they choose to go through it, why not? If they felt like this was going to better their life and help them better emotionally connect to the child and make them think that they would be a better mother. But we think that gays benefit from the system, right? The way that lesbians now don't have to sleep with random men to be able to get a biological child, they can go through IVF instead, maybe to a trusted family friend being the sperm donor, and this has allowed lots of lesbian couples to achieve plenty of happiness within Canada. But we think that also what they really wanted to do was to change the entire societal concepts of the family. What you don't do is target the tiny minority of society who are infertile. What you need to do is basically, streamline the adoption process, allow gay couples to be able to have kids, allow maybe encourage the kind of one village raising an entire child kind of communities. These things don't happen when you encourage adoption, when you elevate and fetishize the idea of a nuclear family being the only possible ones to take care of a child, rather than perhaps even an orphanage or a nunnery who might possibly perceive some kind of community spirit amongst children. We don't think these are illegitimate ways of having a family, Mr. Speaker. We think that these are better ways by having more kinds of families out there and accepting these families rather than forcing people to adopt children they can't really take care of, and then elevating and fetishizing that a nuclear family is the best thing ever. These reasons go with position.
Thank you very much, member of opposition. Now, can you please have I speak on your
Listen to the sort of language we heard from closing opposition. If I cannot reproduce, I am being punished by the state. Because being forced to adopt a child and being unable to have a child of my own flesh is a punishment. I have a simple question. How would a child who has actually been adopted into a family feel hearing something like that? Because it is this overriding belief that adoption is a curse visited upon a family that results in the sorts of psychological trauma accruing to children who have been adopted into families whose parents could conceivably love them, because maybe love doesn't just happen within the boundaries of biology. And this kid who is told by society that he is a punishment inflicted on his parent is going, regardless of how well his family has been arranged, is going to suffer. And this is a harm which we cannot countenance in government. So we think like the real problem with this debate is that like I'll just throw out a whole hash of various kinds of harms. We're going to classify these harms by suggesting that most of these harms are derived from discrimination. And there are three kinds of discrimination that happen. One, discrimination against adopted children. Two, discrimination against women. Three, discrimination by class and gender. So we're going to discuss how each of these kinds of discrimination results in the harms which so desperately wanted to avoid and why it is better for us to side with government. Adopted children. So while we are thankful for opening government for pointing out that it's a good thing for adopted children to be brought into a home that they can be cared for. Both sides generally agree this would be a good thing, right? We don't think there was much contest over here. But the bigger problem is even when they are adopted, they are often unhappy. Why are they unhappy? Because, like we said earlier, the overriding societal message is that there is something wrong with being an adopted child. As closing opposition conceded, there are cultures where being an adopted child is an insult and a slander to your family. This hurts adopted children even when they have been adopted. So the general problem is that natural birth is fetishized. And this is really the root of opening opposition's position, right? Opening opposition said, well, look, but if we don't have biological parents, there'll be less affection, no long-term needs cared for. The psyche of the child is hurt. Yes, and the root cause of all of these factors is the fact that parents think they have to have a biological kid before they can give him the same amount of affection, no thank you, before they can care for him and his long-term needs in the same way. The very language, you're not the best parent you can be, is born off of a perception that in order to be a good parent, you have to be the literal biological dad or mom, no thank you, of that person whom you cared for. So the root of opening opposition's problems is precisely in this issue of perception. We think we fight perception better. But okay, opening opposition also said there's a problem with moral hazard because now we're just going to keep having like, no thank you, we'll just irresponsibly give kids away to orphanages, right? All right, like number one, a parent who is able to give away like a kid, biological or not, is probably going to do it regardless of whether or not he thinks that like that kid is going to be adopted someday. People dissociate, right? They're not thinking of like whether or not the kid's going to have a future. Just like, all right, I'll leave him here. He's probably taken care of. But second, like on balance, if we can increase the number of adoptions, then this problem is mitigated. So why does ALSA succeed in fighting discrimination? Because we normalize the practice of adoption as a viable alternative. Consider the comparative, right? If we allow people to go for IVF and for sperm transfusions is the wrong word, but for sperm donation, right? That's right. Like if we allow these options to exist, then the perception is always there. So an option which is preferable. Right? And of course, this perception, this option is generally limited by money that comes in later. But as long as we allow for this class of options to exist, and for people to always say, I choose this because this is better, there's always going to be the idea that some kinds of children are better than other kinds of children. The adopted children, another child is the last resort. It's not the best option, not the first option we can go for. We obviate this range of options, thus sending the strong signal of thank you that every child who is adopted is a legitimate child. There is no better option for a person who cannot have a child than to adopt, because adopting a child, thank you, is the perfect way to bring a person home. So on these counts, we fight oppression, we fight discrimination against adopted children. This means that this is likely to mean that more children will be adopted in the long run, thus addressing OG's concern about bringing more children out of orphanages. It also be happier. Let's deal with some of the material which closing opposition gave us. So thank you. They said we're coercing parents into adopting like older kids, adopting older kids. This is just not true because like there's a vast oversupply of children of all ages. You are always going to be able to choose. The other second problem, which was that there's cultural displacement because people adopt for trivial reasons. Okay, like this is an argument for improving like regulation over adoption procedures, right? Like status quo, it's standard operating procedure to make sure the person adopting is a good fit for the child. It's actually someone who cares for the child for more than just fame and fortune. But finally, again, we're going to point out this is a problem rooted in perception. Why do people adopt? Because they think that because adoption is the worst possible option, my doing so elevates me as a human being because I'm being charitable to this poor child. Again, the root of this problem of trivial adoption is precisely in the perception that adopted children are less. So thank you. These are the first kind of discrimination. Second, discrimination against women. And we think closing opposition just basically did not respond to the heart of Jan's argument. Like, IVF is harmful and traumatic. And conceivably, I'm going to suggest, they said pregnancy is too. It is worse than pregnancy in so many ways. Like the sheer psychological trauma, I'll take you in a moment, of being exposed to batteries of tests over entire periods, the disappointment of seeing tests coming negative, of coming back neutral, of having to wait another few months, the traumatic and invasive procedure of having your eggs extracted and having an implantation conducted, the medical risks of developing complications which can kill the mother, mean that in the majority of cases there is significant trauma associated with this choice. Yes, sir?
So, foreign parents who can't financially support their kids sometimes send their kids to adoption centers because they care for the child. You essentially now under policy incentivize parents to actually take care of the kids and show love to the kids.
Yeah, it's a good thing to incentivize parents to care of the kids. We don't see that as a problem. Moving on. So like even if closing off tells us that you can choose to take certain harms upon yourself, we've argued in Yarn that this is not a fair choice you are exposed to. Why? Okay, so aside from the basic problem of being able to visualize consequences, it is also the huge problem of the overriding pressure on women to make this decision. Consider entirely like closing out when they said there are some cultures where it is just better, where there's a huge value judgment that people adopt. Precisely, it is in these cultures, in patriarchal cultures like these, where women are coerced into making a decision that is damaging to their body, damaging to their mind. So we reject this idea that there is a fair choice involved, not so, especially in the context established by closing opposition. Finally, class. Now, we've told you in Yang's speech that by establishing a dichotomy between the better option of IVF and the poorer option of adoption, this basically means like poor families are always going to be consigned. They're always going to feel like they have no choice but to take the worst option. This translates directly into the relationship between parent and child. When the parent thinks, like, I had no choice but to adopt this child. I could have had a better child in the language of opening opposition if only he had my genes. I'm forced to deal with a child who isn't a perfect fit. So this classist discrimination translates into the relationship between parent and child. The exact same argument goes for lesbian families and for gay families, because we are forcing them to think that that somehow an inferior choice if and when they are unable to afford IVF. For all these reasons, we fight discrimination back on government. We're proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Whit. And now to conclude round 4 of Ukm Iv, invite the officer to here.
The problem inside opposition is they also, while accusing us of making, government, while accusing us of making a value judgment, are themselves doing the very same thing. They accuse us of saying that having the option to go through IVF versus adoption therefore implies that IVF is necessarily better. Then I ask them this, is having the option for those parents who aren't infertile to have a biological child a morally inferior choice to adoption, or is that a value that you are also willing to allow? Because under your model, if it's not, then you would therefore ban all biological children in that case, because you think that is a morally inferior choice under your model. So but clearly you're not proposing that because you're saying, because fertile parents can still have their own children. So there is this is a value judgment where parents are able to make that particular judgment based on their culture, based on religion, based on the fact that it is important to them to have someone to say that, yes, this is my biological child, and for whatever reason, that is important to them. And they give us no reason whatsoever to say that that choice is morally inferior to another. Merely calling it a moral choice does not necessarily make it inferior. And the second thing I'm going to prove to you in today's debate is that the outcome necessarily of adoption, while Natalie already told you that this doesn't mean adoptions are going to increase as a result, but to the extent that it actually does increase, those outcomes are probably going to be worse off not only for the families, but also for the children as well. Because at the point where you have to understand, this was also present in Natalie's speech, the reasons why people go through IVF are not the same reasons why people adopt. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about in today's debate. A couple of rebuttals don't necessarily fit within those two things. They want to talk to us, side government as a whole, about the stigmatization that actually exists. Have a seat. About how this will the stigma that exists against adopted kids in the status quo. We don't think that stigma necessarily exists because we think that value exists based on culture, based on religion, based on personal values. That's not necessarily a stigma that everyone carries. Case in point, we see that a lot of people necessarily go through adoption as an option. Everyone who wants to just have a kid, and there's a lot of people that just want to have a kid and don't care for DNA or progeny, those people are adopting anyways.
but the people who actually go through IVF make a conscious decision to do so. They go through the extreme cost and time and dedication, and yes, even the suffering of the woman through like the battery of tests and perhaps the disappointment of it not working, because this is something that is clearly very important to them. So that's something that you cannot take away and just say, oh, that's just a moral value that we don't necessarily agree with, because in that case, you should be banning anyone from having any biological children whatsoever. Have a seat. So they wanted to tell us also about how like this is going to be like, this is bad for poor people because poor people won't be able to access this sort of thing. Poor people aren't necessarily adopting in droves anyways, because they don't want to adopt probably, or to the extent that they do, they can't probably afford to do so. But like to the ones that do want to, to the ones that can afford to adopt and pass through like the test and you know, to make sure that they are able to adopt, they're able to adopt in the status quo. Removing IVF as an option does not necessarily take away any of the stigma from them. Let's talk about what are the two possible outcomes here in today's debate. First, let's have a seat. First, either these parents will choose to either what's going to happen is either going to choose to adopt because like DNA because DNA necessarily is important to them, but then all the challenges that Natalie brought to you in today's debate will come into play, or they choose their problem. What's going to end up happening is they will choose not to adopt because they don't want to deal with all these challenges. So to the extent when you ban IVF, adoptions are not necessarily going to skyrocket. Adoptions will necessarily only marginally increase, but to the extent that it does, that's going to be harmful. And here's why. Because the challenges Natalie brought you were quite clear. These past kids, for example, is something that a lot of parents aren't able and capable to deal with. Information you know, telling the child later on that you were adopted, that's a challenge within itself. The influence on the adopted child on other children within the family as well is something, especially if the child comes and here's the thing, they're probably a teenager that came maybe from an economically different background or a social or culturally different background, for example, that is not necessarily in line with like what that family is used to. This causes friction between not only between the child and the family. This is a worse quality of life, like within the foster care system or within like the orphanage or whatever. And what's worse now is you put that choice and the harm that happens on the child now on the conscience of the parents, because the only way for them to have a child under your model is therefore to adopt. So therefore, what's going to happen now is if they make that decision, all those harms that happen to the child will be on their conscience. So what's going to happen is those parents will probably not want to adopt in the first place. So adoptions won't necessarily increase because they want to avoid that sort of harm. They wanted to say that, oh, we already checked to make sure that like kids are a good fit in the first place anyways, to make sure that actually happens. But now they already told you in your speech that is not often discovered until much later in the process, for example, where you pass the initial battery of tests to make sure that you're a good fit for the child, but later on it's only months and maybe years later that I discovered that, you know what, this probably wasn't a good fit because the child was too damaged, for example, and is not able to cope, and the parents aren't able to deal with this sort of system. That's the harm that happens only under your model, when they feel that's the only option. Yes?
But you paint us a reducing picture of adoption. Would you ban adoption?
No.
What do you do with these kids whom you say are too damaged to save?
No, here's the thing. For the parents that feel this is worth it for them, that feel that these challenges are something that they can do and that they can cope with, those parents are already adopting. So the only ones that are going to be marginally increasing, like the adoption numbers, are the ones that would not be able to deal with these challenges, are the ones that would suffer, and the children would suffer under these consequences. Those are the people that are going to be adopting far more under your model. They wanted to also tell us that, like, oh, women are going to be worse off now because they're forced to go through batteries of tests and they risk of death and disappointment. But those are things, again, that birth mothers, like first-child birth mothers, also have to go through. And these are choices that these women made necessarily within their own lives. We don't see why that's necessarily a morally bad choice for them to make, because that also exists for like normal childbirth. Unless you guys want to come up here and argue that childbirth as a whole is bad, we don't think that's a tenable position. Then they want to tell us about like forced IVF, and like the last like minute of his speech, that like in these sort of patriarchal societies, women are forced because of these values to like go through IVF. That's not necessarily the case, because women aren't. You can't force a woman to go through a series of tests, make sure she sits there, gets the swab, and make sure through multiple attempts and cost of money to force her to go through that. That's not something that actually happens in today's society, and because most societies do accept adoption as a viable option if they do happen to be infertile. And the fact that they want to have their own child is not a morally inferior choice. They never prove that that's to be the case, but to the extent that adoption will increase, it will be more harmful for the child and for the parents, specifically because of the nature of the children and the parents that will be adopted.
thank you very much. You may now cross floor, shake hands, and leave the room while we go to the Oh, that was so cool.